Greetings, ladies and mental gents, and welcome to my channel, where I like to make audio narrations of stories from across the internet. In this series, we'll be focusing on a web novel called There Is No Epic Lucha, Only Puns, from the website ReUpload. And in this video, we'll be doing chapters 95 to 97. I hope that you enjoy. There is no epic lucha, only puns, chapter 95. All action, no talk. Perhaps the best part of Seth and Chris walking past the grinning Fran, newly respawned, was seeing Rudy blinking at them as she returned from her paradise snooze. Delta's being invaded by nerds, she announced, and slung her new sword over her shoulder. Delta had heard her call it magma, and it was an awesome-looking sword, but it also had a bit of a edgy for her. Delta snorted as Rudy's words had her own little joke. Rudy shot the general direction a smirk, away from her core, but having her own manner to push out Delta's out gradually. Rudy wasn't able to see her anywhere near as clearly as before. It was a shame, but it made aiming for the 4th floor a goal in the long term. Delta was beginning to wonder if the 10th floor would give her a proper sense of taste. Sure, she got impressions of the things she devoured. God would still make her stomach curl up, but it wasn't the same as eating. "Ah, fair milk lady of the forest," Seth announced, speaking as if his tongue didn't work. Delta stared at Rudy, ignored the words, and waved. Chris gave her a long look. "What have you been doing?" he asked with an outright suspicion. Rudy walked past and clapped him shoulder hard. "Fought an underground fortress of unliving and ghouls and Delta's 3rd floor. I think I found whatever it was Ma and her friends were ignoring," she explained, and Chris looked at the sword for a moment and Rudy shrugged. "Someone chucked it at me. By the ancient laws of the gnomes, it's mine now," Rudy said quickly. Chris and Seth shared a look. Gnomes actually have very detailed and finicky laws. Chris stared at Rudy and blew a raspberry at him. "Again, I declare you nerds." She waved him off and nodded to Seth. "You look like a mess. What did you do?" she asked, confused. Seth touched his pale arm. "I locked my passion with Sir Fran. He pierced me, and I him," Seth said proudly. Rudy gave him a long look, smacked her lips, and walked to the bar without a word. Seth turned to Chris. "I announced myself wrong?" he asked. Delta was both baffled and the pink Seth's words. Delta and Fran came to the door before the two men went down to the 2nd floor. She used him as a mouthpiece to his amusement. It had been a while since he'd had that task. "Seth, why are you speaking like an idiot to everyone else? Rudy thinks me and you engaged in a far more impassioned combat," Fran asked. Seth blinked and he looked a little horrified at his own words. Chris blinked wildly and smacked himself. "Of course, Dungeon Translation. This would have saved so much damn time," he muttered to himself. Chris cleared his throat. "Delta, this may be rude and potentially risking your wrath, but I'm a blunt man. You don't have ears or a mouth," he stated. Delta touched her avatar's ears and frowned. "Well, sure, they were made of mana, too thin to be heard, but she had them. You do not have an ear, canal, or nerves or a tongue to speak. Everything you do is through mana. Sound and other stimuli are casually absorbed and translated in real time by your dungeon." Seth spoke up, but his tone went oddly distracted. Chris looked pained. "He's nectaring again," he said faintly. Seth paced the small corridor. "Words are essentially noises given meaning. It's symbolic, but your dungeon can use those small hints of humanity and intent to make sense of them. Mana is easily influenced by memories, elements, power, and intent. As a dungeon, you take all of these things and use them to grow." Seth went on. Delta was panicking because she didn't have a notebook or pen to write this down. Was there going to be a test? Delta didn't perform well under test conditions. She blanked. So as a dungeon who is friendly and lovely as a rose, your ability to be a universal translator to current affairs or read lost texts of ancient tombs would be amazing. Seth beamed. Chris began to push him towards the stairs. "Stop flirting, get moving. I swear you'll end up with someone's bed if I leave you alone for too long. You already got intimate with the dungeon boss. Let's not have you humping the walls," Chris grumbled. Fran blinked slowly. "My heart belongs to fight in my job," he called after them, as if trying to make sure that his intent was not misunderstood. Delta gave his head a firm pat. "I believe you," she solemnly said. Fran didn't look amused. Seth watched as the stone became wood. The smell of damp earth and caves was swiftly replaced by the scent of wild world of life. Quist pushed open the room that hosted the stairs, leading back up to the view it revealed actually took Seth's breath away. It was a new world. Towering trees and crowned by a veil of mist. Soft, actual light floated through the peaceful scenery to make a dazzling first impression. Seth closed his eyes and heard the birds singing songs, things moving in the underbrush. This jungle, this cradle of life, was simplistic but rich. He took a few steps forward and he felt more pure water. He could hear the distant song of a waterfall nearby. Fran, the bar, Overlord Mushy, and even the Fantastic. But this spoke to Seth. Quist looked unimpressed. This was Quist's nose down and slow blinked unimpressed. That meant that he'd seen this before rather than just he didn't like it. Growing up together was vastly different cultures and language, which neither were willing to learn out of some childish triviality at the time. Taught Seth more about Quist than words could ever really reach. Sure, they could talk in magic, but that was dangerous. Blasting. The general path forward was clear, and Seth decided to stroll rather than to rush on. Quist seemed to be fine with it, really. Alone, like this, it was always quiet in between them. They simply just didn't need noise. And they talked too much. That would echo in the hall where their teacher once was. How she would blab on, in those their languages of the others Seth had never heard of. The trees that Seth could see looked to be offshoots of the trees outside, were greatly mutated and enlarged. He wondered what a proper lumberjack class would make of the wood. Sell the treated plants or blocks to the blacksmiths or other crafting jobs. What a wondrous creation would be brought forth. There were a few other trees, but they were unknown to Seth, unless he had 10,000 uses in common potions and made good tea. Seth's education on green things was actually lacking. He would have to visit the nice druid woman, Dabagost, for her opinion, bring her to the dungeon for an easy translation. The idea of an actual universal translator tickled Seth's fancy. Imagine the sheer joys of learning between two very different people or creatures if they could bridge any language or use a noise that counted as talking. Could the dungeon understand animals? Seth was curious to know, but not enough to speak, to ruin the sheer serene feeling that he had walking under the thin shadows of the towering trees. The artificial sun was above, peeking through and making his skin feel warm, and the heat was just slightly more than the warm day, and was actually quite nice. Fighting with Fran, earning his way, it was worth it. Seth had found somewhere that had clear signs of someone having no idea what they were doing. This mismatch of trees, blooming flowers in the shade of root of plants exposed, out of lack of proper insects that would be found normally. Oddly placed benches, and Seth stopped to test it. It was a little chaotic, but the sheer joy and effort Delta had put into this place shone clearer than any biological or ecological mistake. This jungle was ambition in its pure form. The bench was nice too, just firm enough to not be too solid to make it uncomfortable. Delta had gotten the curve of the seats just right. What a girl! Quist looked up at the giant trees with a small frown. Seth knew what he was thinking about. Hard not to know when it sometimes plagued Seth as well. Memories. But after a while, Quist relaxed on the bench on his knees and unclenched. He pulled out a flask and took a little slight sip. Seth actually rolled his eyes and then accepted the flask when it was offered. He blinked as the scent hit his nose. It wasn't booze. It was tea. Seth stared down at the flask. That exact kind of tea was... He sipped it and said nothing. Seth didn't have to say anything about why. The taste hit the back of his throat and he gagged. Like behind the death cow, he shivered. Quist nodded. Just the way she liked it. He grinned and took another sip himself and grimaced. Seth mulled it over. She meant Dessen. Liked Siart. Seth nodded with a small smile since he had made sure that he got what Quist said. One day he'd get this language thing, but at the same time, Seth also never wanted to learn. Their habits, their way of interacting, was how they had always been. Seth was stupidly worried if he learned Quist's language, things might change between them. Funny how the little things could get to Seth. A little orange bird landed on the armrest of the chair, and the two men looked at it. It was a squat little thing with a puffed-up chest and little round eyes. It was a bright orange and looked like it had no idea that cute things like itself would ever have many predators. Then it spoke. "You got beaten by Fran so badly that you and a whole other person got benched," the bird chirped. Quiz looked confused as the bird was speaking to Seth in Seth's language. Seth's mouth dropped open, and he watched as the bird looked mightily pleased with itself. "You speak? How interesting!" Seth leaned down until he was eye to eye with a ball of feathers. "I speak to break the ice." The bird peered at Seth's newly healed arm, which he had indeed still felt massively cold from the dangerous use of the element. Chris mumbled something and licked his lips at the bird. Well, it did look like it would be a nice cooked piece of bird, but Seth was aghast that Chris would eat something so cute. "You are too damn cute even to eat," Seth announced. The bird tilted its head. "That's taking roasting to a whole new level. Well, what do you expect from a fire mage? I'm Inchi, and I'm part of your tour guide." The bird chirped, and a shadow loomed over Seth. He looked up at a pale form of a gangly man with a beady black eyes and thin, painted smile. "Hello?" Seth offered. The man bent down slowly when the hair prickled on Seth's skin, and the mime squeezed Seth's nose and honked. Noise sounded out. "This is part of A. That's Rennie. That's the real chatterbox. He started making a noise. Before he was kind of a quiet fellow." "Inchi," the bird announced. Quiz stared regretfully at the flask that Seth stood, offering his hand to the odd creature. Mimes and junglers weren't exactly connected, but maybe the wild tribe of mimes or something. Delta could be a bit weird like that. The creature Rennie shook it, and everyone turned to Quiz. "Touch me and regret it. I'm hungover," he snapped. "Oh." Seth knew those words. Quiz had said them a lot over the years. The bird tilted its head and saw something to the man. Quiz eyed the bird and reached slowly for it, and the fire appearing in his hand. Rennie neatly picked Inchi up and stuffed him under the odd jester hat he had. "So you're our guide. Where shall we go first?" "I'm very eager to see more," Seth beamed. The mime looked at him, and then a smile painted on his pale face split. An opening like a demonic egg, revealing rows of serrated black teeth. The mime held out a hand as if to offer Seth a whimsical handheld tour. Under the hat, the bird's muffled tones could be heard. "Rennie asks if you trust him." He was informed. Seth shared a look with Quiz, but then the man was downing a second flask that he had pulled out of his boot. Seth turned back and hesitantly took the offered hand. "Yes," he replied. And Seth hoped that Delta hadn't lured him into a trap by using an entire level to make him think that she was nice and good. That would just suck. Rennie nodded and smile vanished. Loud footsteps sounded from the trees. Everything shook. Something very big was approaching. "Then Rennie shall take you on a magic pet ride. It has the best views and only the smells a little. Lots of monkeying about to get a ticket, though, so feel lucky." And she cheered. Seth didn't feel lucky. He felt small. The trees parted and a monster that did belong in the jungle appeared. It wore a little hat and a tassel and a sample banner-like jacket that read, "Rennie's Magical Pet Ride. Wilhelm has eaten 0 people in the last 24 hours. Seth blinked, and then he felt excited. This was fun. He took a step forward, and Quiz just dragged him back. "No, thank you. We'll risk the bugs and the annoyance of the tiny bugs." Quiz called, and Seth reached for the magic monkey ride as he was dragged away. "But it's fun." Rennie watched the two guests turn and bend the trees and vanish. He looked to Delta, who was comforting the let-down Wilhelm. He looked at her, questioning as if he should follow. I guess so. I mean, I'm worried Quiz is going to set fire to the jungle or give me more ducks. Waddles is awesome, but I hate to become predictable by having the same thing over on every floor." Delta announced. Rennie looked around at the growing mushrooms and decided not to say anything. "Their grosses are cooked. Their ducks are fur." Inchi was prodded by Rennie as he chirped in annoyance. Rennie took off and listened to Delta explain to Wilhelm how the circus was soon to be much better, and that cheered the creature up and Rennie up. This wouldn't be so sad. The pretty one seemed pleasant, and Quiz was, well, he could leave tiny thimbles of beer to lure the man to where Rennie wanted him to go. This should be fun, and definitely not that hard. Quiz pulled off his staff from the large coat, space magic, making sure that his rod was not on display to the public. Seth knew Quiz had a large staff, but seeing it was always made Seth hold his own wand a little more uncertainly. Power, or control, girth, or grace. Seth had no idea what truly was better. A challenge! See, Seth, the frog wants me to actually be rowdy. Quiz rumbled on and took more swigs from the flask. The giant actual frogman loomed on the far side of the amazingly large bridge that looked like nature herself had grown it over a deep ravine below. I think Hoppy Man will let us dance pass if we do not aim our rods at him. Seth tried to calm his friend down. I'll point my rod whoever gets in the way. I'm a wizard, and I put a lot of work into getting my rod this powerful. What's the point of not shoving it in people's faces after all that work? Quiz scowled. Seth gave him a flat look. You did work a little. You jumped into a pit of fire and walked out holding a rod. Not work, idiot. Seth reminded. Quiz sniffed. An idiot with a big hot rod. Now excuse me, Seth. I am going to do mortal combat with my new arch-rival, the giant frog with a bigger stick than me. But clearly mine is magical and better. He stomped off. The giant frog leveled his log-shaped weapon and walked forwards at the same time as Quiz. Seth covered his eyes and waited. Delta was yanking on her shirt collar and blowing out hot air through her cheeks in flaming orange. They can't be saying those things in public. What if Dio was around? What if Gemi was around? Delta yelled and pointed to Giant. He needs a cold shower, she ordered. Quiz spun his staff and it left burning streaks as it moved. He smirked at his foe. I am a highly trained weapons master with the staff. Even without magic, I am dangerous to underestimate. He warned the frog. The frog paused and then threw his weapon to Quiz casually. He caught it in confusion, and the frog picked him up and tossed him over the edge before Quiz had time to adjust at having a rod in each hand. He hit the mist, and his cursing turned into a large, drawn-out noise that the mist warped his swearing into some sort of weird man's scream. He hit the water, and a beast emerged from the water and stood over him. Do not be scared of the water, because I am here. Another frog promised in red shorts and holding a trident. Quiz glared at the water bubble around him, and the heat rose. Back on the bridge, Seth coyly leaned against the bridge railing near the giant frog. You were very smart. Those muscles aren't your best asset after all. Seth grinned. The frog looked away, his dark green cheeks turning darker. Do you have days off? I love a man who can make Quiz look like a fool at times. I'm Seth, and I'm delighted to meet you. He held out his hand. It was gently shook by the giant. Ah, you're shy. Seth laughed good-naturedly as the frog idly kicked the ground. The giant frog gestured to the stack of staves that he had ready to fight. Oh, not me. I couldn't bring myself to harm such a shy, handsome knight like you. But I'll wait here until Quiz comes roaring back, if that's okay. He said, and the giant frog looked almost lost until he pulled out containers of honey and fruit juice and ice-cold water. He gestured for Seth to sit on the bridge and join him. Oh, Sir Frog, I am in your tender care. Seth beamed. The frog blushed and actually managed to smile back. Giant, my name. The hill of a frog offered. His voice was deep but not loud. Careful. Seth, so giant is that muscles for your heart. Cause the fruit water is delicious, and you're a saint for sharing it on a warm day like this. Seth sighed in relief as he drank. Giant said nothing but poured more for Seth to enjoy. Then I said I was short of 4 stones, and Bob swore that he didn't cheat. Of course, it was his crabs that had done it, but Bob is clever like that. Rail explained as he calmly rowed a tiny log over to Quiz and sat there, feet in the water as he listened, bored. He saw something glinting and spotted 2 tiny red crabs carrying the sealed flask into the white pool. Quiz watched in horror as they jumped into the deep abyss with his booze. After them, he commanded Rail. The frog grinned. Some things aren't worth diving too deeply for, he warned. Quiz met his eyes. If I get sober in the next 10 minutes, I'll drown the next person who speaks to me. he answered. His rescuer merely rowed the log over to the deep black pool and watched. Quiz slid off and held his breath, diving. Seth had a dozen or so breathing charms and transformations to swim, or to move the water itself. Quiz had the art of looking like a drowned rat as he dived and clung to the tunnel walls to sink deep. He saw his glinting treasure near the bottom and shifted silt and sand. He reached for it. 2 devilish crabs watched in glee. So quiet into the bridges, Seth nodded, and the giant hugged his knees. Giant figured it was a gentle being, and every time he reached for the honey to suckle more fruit, Seth immensely enjoyed the sight of flexing muscles and the solid jawline grinning. He was nudged by Rennie and the bird Inchi. Time to go, tour is waiting, the bird encouraged. Seth turned to the giant, and the frog offered him one last clay cup of water for the road. This has been quite lovely. I'll be back, he promised, and Giant nodded, pleased to hear it. In the distant fountain of water erupted, and Quiz screamed that sounded like a 5-year-old seeing the dire cockroach for the first time. Right, Quiz is on his own. He's upsetting some poor thing. I can't take that man anywhere without something catching on fire or being banished from the kingdom. Seth threw his free hand up in disgust. Where's next? Seth asked when Inchi and Rennie shared a look. The bees, Inchi said quietly. Bees? Seth echoed. Bees. In the dark shadows of the jungle, tiny forms watched the tall one. His hair shimmering like gold, and it would be fine tribute for the goddess Delta. The pygmies raised their spears and began to hunt. Then the chapter. There is no epic loot here, only puns. Chapter 96, Door to Door. Delta was desperately wanted to watch Seth, to watch her work be enjoyed and admired, but she managed to pull herself away as the man was settling down to drink water with the giant. The large frog was actually very sweet when he deemed Seth as a guest and not a challenger. It was pure ego to stalk each and every visitor, that and maybe a little loneliness in the wildest terms. Delta had many friends now, her monsters knew and even Sis. But there is something about people who chose to come to Delta to make those kinds of relationships more surprising and a little more valued at times. The love of one's family and the company of those who choose to befriend Delta. Floating down to the 3rd floor, she felt her mind expand, a slow awareness of all of within her space. She felt her mind wash over the map room and model of the world and the craggy edges, then seep into the library and the guardians in wait, their creature content to be unaware as possible. She swept past the nastily snoozing and the troll cave and Jeb stirring more troll stew. The horrid mixture broken down into several strands of mana, and the multi-leveled bonds that made the thickness of the stew. The shimmering tiny threads that formed the vapor and scent, the shimmering mana that was formed and taste. There was a pure creation in Jeb's cooking pot, and only by allowing her dungeon senses to take over human ones could Delta appreciate what was happening. Jeb didn't get ingredients or harvest food, he just stirred a pot, concentrated, and the dungeon made stew like magic. Countless complicated mathematical mana equations, magic, but still, a wonderful when simply observed. It was so faithful that what Jeb thought of troll stew would be, it was actually a vial in anyone who tasted it. Jeb himself was a walking light show of shifting orange mana. His arms were slightly brighter than the rest of his body, still healing. Delta floated there, comparing Jeb with what she saw in Swa. Swa had a wild inner energy, energetic and constantly reshaping itself, as if to remind Delta of the fact that goblins had sheer potential for anything if given the tool. Jeb was slower, sturdier. His mana was like a growing moss that promised regrowth no matter the damage unless it was from fire. The gargoyles, while all different shapes, had the same inner ethereal mana that showed their stone forms were not the whole being. The mana sometimes floated in and out of the gargoyles' bodies as if tasting the air. It showed how even if their eyes and their other senses were of stone, their spirits were far more aware of their surroundings than one could guess. Jack, on the other hand, was hidden mostly from Delta's senses, perhaps due to the nature of being a contractee. The tiny flickering of orange mana barely shone within Jack, but what little sparks Delta did see revealed a deep fissure in the man's facets. like a cracked diamond. Beautiful, but a little sad. Delta floated through the floor, carefully observing the feast hall. Various bubbling dishes that couldn't be prepared in a tiny kitchen on the upper floor, and soon arrived in the garden of choice. She didn't use a menu in this mind state. Delta looked at the room, and bubbles of potential rose up to sea of manna, where things had been chosen by Sis but worthy of Delta's attention. The giant new statue had various ideas. Delta tilted her head and saw how, with a staggering amount of dungeon points, it could come to life. At the thought of her rare currency, their world shifted to reveal something Delta had never really given proper thought to. Dungeon points. Delta held out her hand, and a tiny crystal with shimmering rainbow surface floated over one of her fingers. It was barely bigger than a teardrop. A single dungeon point. It was a crude term for what Delta could now see was something deeply precious. It wasn't a gemstone. This crystallized form was only how Delta's still learning mind could best see it. The true nature of the energy was far harder to grasp, but Delta decided to tackle that another day. DP was gained when the dungeon broke down an object or person. The more unusual or powerful the item, the more DP Delta gained. Her slightly detached mind turned the gem over and saw the lights bend and dance of unheard music. It was not one type of mana or even a few. It was almost like the dungeon condensed the history of an item itself into a single point. Every experience, every second of existence. The pain, the love, the growth, it was all squeezed down into a single point. Potential in its purest form. It was siphoned from the item and fed into the system where the energies let Delta make child's play of the world's rules. It was so easy now that Delta could see that the very thing that she used to make the jungle from nothing, life and an ecosystem from nothing, was fueled by creation and potential itself. But it also, in this moment, Delta saw why people gave the most DP of all. Short of legendary items, no doubt. Delta detached herself more. She peered into the memory of the system, the machine, and the operation run by a being who had nothing much else to do. So each part of Delta could even comprehend was neat, tidy, sterile. She tugged and lured the moment when the farmer died into the dungeon. So long ago, but so very recently. The man died. The echoes of regret and pain reattached Delta in the mindset even now. It felt painful and sore but human. Delta used it as a lifetime, knowing which way to go when she was done. Ready to go home once she was done. The farmer died and his being was absorbed. His mana was taken, mostly a bit green and brown and hints of red. His history of hard-working man and the earth, but with a passion for his loved ones. My name is Sir. I'll do what I can, you old bast. I love you. You slept with His name will be dull, like my grandpa. My name is Sir. The words exploded out of the mana patterns, like echoes of the man's memories. Delta let them wash over her, like a burning river. She didn't look away. Delta didn't dare look away. From between the grasps of mana flowing through his body, between the love and the pain, between the regret and pride, a single mote of pure blackness broke free. The dungeon system consumed it and broke it down. This wasn't simply a creation of the brother recycled by the sister in the dance of the sun and moon. The system told Delta this. This was a brand new resource, claimed in the act of consuming a man. Why? Delta watched the scene over and over. Why do people have the darkness in them? Why did the system explode with so much DP from devouring it? My name is Selville. I'm just a farmer. Delta gasped and slammed back into herself, stars flashing past blurry in her eyes. She knelt in the garden and tried to remember to breathe. It took time, as if her mind was wading through sludge and muck, struggling to remember why she had to breathe. I was about to slap you back. You dove too deep. Even Sis was about to pull the plug on your little acid trip. Delta looked up at the box of new. His words were softer than normal. I got lost, she said without thinking. Only you could get lost in your own damn head. The sarcasm dripping down Delta, and she managed to stand up with a weak smile. I don't know. Better my head than my butt, she teased. New turned as if offended. I do not have a rear to be stuck up. I leave that to you and your, fingers and, toe-loving self. Ugh. New actually shivered. Delta had no doubt it was due to the memory of himself having those aforementioned fingers and toes. She smiled, feeling better already. Still, the memory of the floating black mote of, not manner haunted her. Can you ask Sisk about the black spores of people? She asked, the word spore slipping out as if no other word was appropriate. New paused. I'll add it to the report. She's a little distracted. Something about the full moon and family. She mumbles in sounds too low to actually exist. It's annoying. You report to her? Are they like essays to her? Do you report on how you learn valuable lessons every day? Delta grinned. New went quiet. Delta pretended to dab a quill and write in the air. Dear Princess Cecilia. She announced it aloud, and New twitched, and at the bottom of his box a leg formed, pants leg, boot and all, and kicked her in the shin. Delta yelped, hopping from one foot at the contact. That hurt, she whined. New huffed and vanished. Come back. Clearly you just write sarcastic comments and underline how I mess things up. She called, but she was alone. Our dungeon is run by those two. Dragon announced from above. Delta looked up to see Dragon and Dozer watching with amusement. Kind of explains a lot, Dozer nodded. Ha ha, no comments from the peanut gallery. Delta waved them off with a huff. Both gargoyles landed next to her. Oh, don't be like that. We love it, Dozer said. Dragon leaned in. Like watching a show about dysfunctional couples with a magic box of TV. By the way, when can we get a TV? Dragon asked in a whisper. Dozer shook his head. Siblings, they gave me more of that vibe, he said, and Dragon's maw dropped open. That chemistry? No way! That's like angry rivals who hate each other right up until they kiss, Dragon argued. Delta glared at them, but they didn't seem to notice. New is pure protective, and that is deep sibling stuff, Dozer stated. Dragon threw his claws up. That's the knight and princess dynamic, Dragon said in exasperation. Delta raised her hands and tried a new idea. She gathered more mana in her fists and slammed both down on the gargoyles' heads. The two hit the ground with a hard thump. Confused, they looked up at Delta, who puffed out her cheeks, still blushing as she glared. You both get no booze from Farah, she announced, and the order pinged Farah 2 floors up like an arrow. Dozer and Dragon looked like Delta had gutted them. Wait, no, you're really unlovable spinster. Dragon wailed and tried to hold onto her leg as Dozer ran, as fast as his wings could flap. As Delta turned, eyes blazing orange, hair moving in unseen wind. Spinster! You do have a lot of pets. Spinster isn't too far off at this rate. New, the ever emotionally supportive friend, stated a while later as the 3rd floor monsters gathered to charge another door. New, I will hurt you, Delta warned. Dragon twitched. Delta ignored him. The short trip into Jeb's cooking pot, courtesy of the chanting pygmies, had given the gargoyle a phobia of tiny things with spears and masks. Delta eyed the next door. Doctor reported at some snooping that there was a large amount of, things moving behind this door. It was the laboratory, according to Jack. His exact words, when Delta asked for advice, was as follows. Burn it all to the frickin' ground, Jack hissed, and everyone stared at him. He met each and every one of their eyes, even News, which was impressive since he generally didn't have them. The things that they made me drink, the things that they made others inject. It was real sick man's dreamland. It was like they were looking for the best way to simply make people want to die before they melted. Jack winced at the memory. Delta turned to that simplistic black wood door, and was she really beginning to dislike these people? Let's burn some nerds, she said, and Vanguard kicked down the door so hard it flew off the hinges and smashed its goopy puddle of black slime and chicken bones. No fire, but Jeb ready to smash more moldy chickens, Jeb announced proudly as he crawled through the door and almost caused a roadblock. That was a bad omen. Delta just knew it. Seth enjoyed the jungle. It was nice, and it lacked a lot of things that made most jungles a little, bothersome. There were no blood-sucking flies, blood-sucking frogs, blood-sucking trees, blood-sucking rocks, or blood-sucking leeches. The last one was more forgivable than the rest, but Seth did not enjoy the Crimson Jungle by any means. The gathering of blood mages giving lectures there was very informative, though. Seth still had the buttons that they had handed out of the group slogan. No bad blood between friends. Lovely people. Really, Seth particularly enjoyed their blood massage therapies. Pricey, but good. Delta's jungle was like the blood mages without the death jungle on the way. He stared at the actual river in slow-moving gold. The moat of swirling honey surrounding the high-rising stone pillars were dark clouds of soaring and worked. The moat was broken into several tiny pools where the largest of bees Seth had ever seen used their stingers to nimble legs to widen the pool. The odd thing was that each of the pools, the honey, looked a little different than the main honey river. Wandering near one, the bees moved away, but they did watch him. Seth bent down and stuck his finger into the reddish honey and tasted it. He blinked at the rich texture and the feeling of heat rising up from the tips of his stomach. They've been busy bees, making lots of honey from different jungle flowers. Best not to take too much. It's not nice behavior. Inchi squawked. Rennie, the mime, looked up with one hand, reached up and petted the nearest bee. It was still small compared to the others, but it buzzed happily and began headbutting Rennie's hand over and over, with its stinger actually moved side to side. Dear gods, above and to the side. That was adorable. This honey is very mana-rich. Does Delta let all things in the dungeon become mana-enchanted? Death asked with excitement. He watched 3 bees dive, splashing honey onto themselves, one from each pool. Before they flew slowly around the biggest spiral, smearing as many flowers of honey on the rock. And many smells made Seth's stomach rumble. Rennie looked at him, and a feeling of amusement coming from his frame. Rennie is right. Mama Delta doesn't let or deny anything. Mama is just happy we do our thing. Inchi said with a tiny, warm voice rather than his obnoxious one Seth had come to enjoy. Aren't you all worried that some monster might try and use that to grow, to become too strong for anyone to stop? Delta seems like she'll hesitate to end anything she created. Some monster might abuse that. Seth asked as he bent to examine the blue-hued honey pool, then made the air smell minty. The silence was only noticeable after a few seconds. Not just from Inchi or Rennie, not that the mime made noise unless he wanted, but every bee, every bird song, and every jungle itself was gone silent. Inchi spoke, and the jungle seemed to back him up and support in various noises. No one who is a child of Delta would ever harm her. If such a thing would come into our home, Inchi ruffled his feathers. Rennie flexed and a nearby boulder cracked with a single hand gripped down the middle by the mime. It will be punished. We don't hate people or anything. Hate isn't what we have. Inchi landed on Seth's head. But we'd hate this monster you speak of. Someone who would harm Delta by playing with her love will not be welcome, Inchi said calmly. The lack of puns was making Seth sweat just a bit. He was vastly outnumbered by Delta's monsters, and there were a lot of stingers. But he petted the bird. His interest had piqued more. I'd like to meet your mother. She seems like the kind of lady who would leave a lasting mark on my life. He grinned, and the humor didn't seem to fly as well as he'd hoped, because Inchi lowered his head down and stared right into his eyes upside down. Perverts are prevented from meeting Mama, he declared, and packed Seth's forehead once. I am a charmer, a lover of people, not a plain pervert, he protested, and Inchi pecked him again. Pervert protests too much. Seth the perv. Seth the perv. Inchi sang. Seth didn't like the ways the bees were buzzing with each other, like a giant chain of spreading gossip. The name was going to spread. Well, Seth had been called worse. Rennie helped him up to his feet and then bowed to the spire. Seth followed him on instinct, but was confused until the bee, quite unlike all the others, appeared from the hive above. The golden crown was sort of eye-catching. The frame was powerful, and her wings were like pieces of glass in motion. The sheer aura she gave off commanded respect and Seth's attention. Her stinger was carved like a dagger and glowed orange. She landed on an almost human pose on two legs and folded her wings like a shimmering coat. Her face had features similar to her kid's, but more angular, and her eyes were more sharp in shape. Her antennae ended up in little puffs balls. She looked down at them, and the royal demeanor that showed nothing but faint interest made Seth put his queen on a solid 8 out of 10 for queens. Amazing entrance, unique style of power and position, and a damn curvy for a B. Seth made sure to loosen his ponytail a bit to put on his best smile. He was a bit of an old hand at charming queens and kings, sometimes at the same time. Delta's dungeon was simply amazing. Bob goggled as Quiz patted the giant hellworm. I have the feeling that I have left Seth alone for too long. He sighed, Rail burped, and passed the flask to Bob, who opened up his mouth to let the frog pour the booze into the mouth. Quiz was resting his eyes on the sand next to them. Sure, the meeting had been a bit explosive, but Bob turned out to be a very good guy for a worm. He's not in the river, Rail said seriously, slurring like a champ. Nearby, the two crabs were building a sandcastle, one of whom wobbled and face-planted into the spire and collapsed on top of the other. For two jerks, the crabs were pretty good at making castles, even while being drunk. He sighed and pushed away from the happy haze he was in. I need to find my friend. He's prone to sleeping or making best friends with anything and anyone. Being in the middle child of 15 kids kind of gave him needy habits. Quiz mused. Bob whined and Quiz leaned in and butted his head on the nice-looking glowy body of Bob. Hey, I'll be back. It's my job as a peacekeeper to PK jerks who give the dungeon problems. I'll bring you all a ball or something, Quiz promised. Bob slowly sank back into his pool like a metal chain being let go. He stood, and something rustled nearby. Rail looked over and frowned heavily. What are they up to? He mumbled. Quiz was having a bad flashbacks of needle darts and screaming. From the bush came 3 tiny little mushrooms in leafy skirts and big goofy wooden masks. They barely came up to Quiz's knee, at best. I'm scared they're not shooting first, Rail said quietly. Do we run? Quiz hissed. Rail shook his head with enough energy to make his face wrinkle. No, they'll get excited, he warned. From behind the 3 came a new figure, a slow-moving figure in robes holding up a tiny mushroom-capped staff. This pygmy mushroom had more of a unique soul to it. Oh, it's one of the uniques. Rail bent down and peered as if it was rare sight he didn't get to see often. Uniques. More than one. Ugh. The little demons were evolving. The priest pygmy, for it was giving off a weirdly holy aura that the faithful developed, chittered at Quist. I object to that claim, he guessed. Often he got more complaints than compliments, so the odds were in his favor. They've come to bargain. The teachings of Delta have... Oh, wow. Delta got mad at you all. Rail said in surprise, and the priest chittered and chirped. I'll share, but it's mine. Quist hugged his flask. Months of inscribed space and storage sigils had let him hoard enough for days like this. The little priest shook his head and pointed at Quiz, and then did some off pose with both hands, held up like he was holding something. They want your golden wires. I think they mean your hair. Rail translated. Quiz touched his beard and then hair. Mage hair is very private. You can't take it. He protested. Rail blinked. Can other mages use it to harm you? He asked in shock. Quiz snorted. No, but hair-growing spells are complicated, and potions take months to make. Every time a mage loses a hair, it comes back naturally 1 shade lighter, until you're grey at the age of 15 or 25. Quiz waved his hands in annoyance. Having hair sounds like a pain, Rail admitted. Quiz eyed his smooth, greenish skin. May your warts be forever off colour, he grumbled. He turned back to the waiting demons. Why should I give you my hair? He asked. The priest twirled his staff and whispered something. Rail gasped. They're offering to show you the secret tunnels that could potentially let you bypass what? Rail began, but Quiz snorted. Do you think I need such a handicap? If that's all, he began to turn before more chittering came. And direct access to all-you-can-eat buffet on the 3rd floor, and they can make it so that you don't have to talk to anyone. Rail nodded. Quiz reached up, a blank face, and he pulled out a hand full of hair. Lead to the bus demons, he commanded. The pygmies began to dance in a circle, and the word began to travel back to the village. The Golden One gave many golden wires this day. They would have to find more things to trade with, even more. End of chapter. There is no epic loot, only puns. Chapter 97, Bubbling to the Surface. Delta watched with a hint of nervous energy as the door to the laboratory reclosed behind them. The open hall, with many tiny connected hallways, was a surprising space compared to the silence bit, but Delta used Doctor's eyes to peer into the space. It was more like a dungeon in most real sense, a place where people suffered, and that the sun never touched. Delta paused. Wait, that still sounded like most dungeons of this world. Well, this place was the places where prisoners were sent when their castles were common. Stone walls and drafty floors and hay spread over it to soak up the odd spills, or maybe have the odd worker just collapse for a power nap. The hall itself was arched with the statuesque pillars like twisted bone and howled in the ceiling above. On top of these pillars, spread like roots, Delta had no idea if that was artistic or how the material acted. It didn't look like a normal stone. Too white. Her group moved forward, Nashley and Jib taking the lead. The hall was thankfully much more suited to their size. The gargoyles either used their shoulders as perches or, like Dragon and Dozer, crawled along the ceiling, their stone claws making easy work and handles to fancy roots. Jack was keeping back, making sure nothing got out. Jeb stomped and the creatures that littered the place scattered. They were thick and viscous black puddings. Bones and items sunk in and rose out of their bodies. It was like tiny swamps that had gotten bored and learned to move, but their bubbling slime made flesh a road to turn black on contact. Not that Jeb or Nashley even noticed. Something Delta learned about trolls in general was that their pain receptors never really bothered to develop. From an evolutionary perspective, she guessed, if the creature could regenerate damage, pain wasn't needed to tell them to stop being idiots. Instead, evolution just made the skin thicker and walked away screaming in frustration at what she had just done. The slimes mostly used something as a face. The common theme seemed to be skulls. Delta winced and guessed that she knew what happened to the undead around here. They were stripped down and used as fancy accessories by the puddings. A few of the pudding slimes used helmets or shields, but the general foes used long, dead-eyed sockets and glared at them. One of the puddings lashed out with tentacles and a sword emerged from the slime. It sunk into Jeb slightly before getting stuck. The pudding yanked and pulled with frustration while Jeb looked down. "Re-sword!" He cheered and he stomped the pudding, which made a lot of things scatter across the floor. At least he's having fun, Delta thought. Better the one who can fix himself up than us, Doctor agreed. The gargoyles were neatly avoiding the puddings as best as they could, as their flesh would be exposed to the burning muck while not their stone form. Harder than it looked when the puddings could climb up the walls and give chase. Doctor lashed out. Under his flapping cloak came a series of flasks. Bubbling solutions broke on contact and spread fire across a few of the puddings. Jack cheered in support as the combined efforts of Doctor's oddly poisonous fluids and Jack's bad habit of firebombs, Delta was surprised to learn that each gargoyle had their own weapons, as it were. Gargoyles were actually very cool once Delta explored their biology and powers. It took some explanation on New's part, but the idea was that each gargoyle was unique. Their soul was formed and poured into a statue. Usually, they were considered religious creatures by proxy. Ambient faith for whatever god or goddess or a thing or a toaster, Delta was sure New was joking about the last one, would gather in a temple or church over time. The energy would eventually leak into the building itself, hence the weirdly nice but unearthly feeling such places could get if they were old enough. The side effect was that things would become empowered. The water, the food, the beds, the toilets, and even the mops. It also meant that such fixtures, such as statues and water drainage on the roof had been carved into angelic or demonic-looking creatures, would also get that power. And like in most good stories, the statues and power, they came to life. Now the issue was that each tiny feature and defect of said statue shaped what the gargoyle would and could not do. Delta had a feeling if the monster's template hadn't screwed up and gone wonky, her gargoyles would have been uniform and exactly the same in terms of power and weapons until she learned to control the process. But since Delta had accidentally broke a few tiny, not important things somehow, her goggles were each wildly different. Delta had to reassure herself that the whole defect template thing was no big deal. No big deal at all. As a doctor, lying to yourself is unhealthy, the doctor said airily, and another couple of puddings went up in flame, exploding with more loot. If it was that bad, Sis would have told me, she argued. Doctor's silence was heavy. In the deep desert, a series of 10 or so white gleaming towers stood, with sealed tunnels that arched up between the towers to connect them. The land around the towers was lush with a series of oases. Nearby, a bustling city of towers that tried to impersonate the white towers had been built. It was connected to the towers with several roads and aqueducts, and its people moved on with their lives, unaware of the being that controlled the tower screeching to herself. Dejin stared down at the things before her. She was on her 70th floor, a very important floor. It ended with a 0. It was damn important, and this was what she needed to deal with right now. Her towers reached to the stars, the glowing white spires of beauty and treasure to lure in those from miles around. Dejin refused to bury herself into the dirt like some mole. Many of her lower floors were occupied and facing threats. She had spent a pretty amount of rainbow gems to make her bosses respawn within an hour. Her lower floors were wonderful. Lackluster and somewhat primitive in her early attempts, but the sheer charm of them, her fumbles and successes, were her past, a story, and Dejin didn't have the heart to change them. Her future was ever brighter, and here she was climbing. Her first monster, after months of stockpiling and waiting to buy her new floor, the 7th tower rising by another 100 meters to show that she had done just that. Her monster choice was new and exciting. The sister had always given her interesting choices. Sand-scarred assassin clan, the Thunder Scorpions, and mimic cacti. Each a deadly breed capable of devouring legions of common warriors on their own. She had chosen the Scorpions. Dejin was envisioning some endless plane of storms where one would do deadly battle and dodge death from above. It had nice acoustics once she set it up. Dejin was sure that she could hold some concerts here, and it would be lovely. Well, aside from her audience dying by lightning strike, but the show must go on. Dejin liked pretty things, and these towers were damn pretty. Next, she summoned herself 3 scorpions, but her idea, exactly matching jewel-encrusted scorpions, was ruined. Ruined! One was a tiny thing with huge claws and a twin stinger, an opal and pink diamond on each tail. It curled them together to sting its foes. A second one was so big it lumbered, and its tail was used more to itch its head than attack. And the last one was just orange. Orange! Dejin screeched, but no matter how many times she erased, summoned, they were all so imperfect. Dejin screamed, and the thunderstorm howled with her. Dejin, still screaming, adjusted the storm to be slightly louder and more in sync with her. The light was a bit dim, so she set it to be higher as well. Dejin was a mind that while she had time to rage against the cruel fate that she now suffered, there was still time to make the floor look slightly better. One could have a breakdown and still look perfect. Eventually, she decided that with some effort and random luck, she could work with this. Dejin was a good dungeon, good at what she did, making people die with style and beauty. She made a vaguely colored themed scorpions and did her best to ignore the other issues and sent them to the right towers. Red one to the ruby tower, blue-ish one to the sapphire towers, and the glowing green one to emerald. Dejin had no idea why glowing, but decided to actually look cute once it was in the right spot. Like the towers, the monsters fit them like good shoes. Dejin liked pretty matching shoes. Yes, Dejin could work with this. Her concert might have to be put on hold until she was sure that the monsters wouldn't outdo her, however. That would be tragic. Dejin had a habit of erasing those that outdid her. These odd pudding slime monsters weren't like the blood elemental. There was no core to speak of. One was splattered and black goop remained inert over the stone floor. Thankfully, the inability to dissolve anything but flesh meant that the room wasn't collapsing around them from the acid holes. The thing was that while they displayed reactions to Delta's monsters, they lacked fear or even sense of planning. They rushed forward and consume, stab, swallow, and generally rushed them, but there was no thought of dodging or trying new tactics. Slimes emerged from some side rooms, using beakers, axes, and even a few gnawed bones as weapons. Those rooms needed to be explored, but there was something more important Delta needed to check first. A giant, hollowed-out space in the middle of the large hall held a bubbling cauldron with a bright, glowing green mixture. The mixture inside was still being heated and cooked, despite the space being cut off from the world. That had caught Delta's attention. A doctor was the best one to look into it, but the amount of squishy slimes trying to bombard them with the sheer numbers was beginning to wear even her trolls down. Dragon opened his maw and several of them burst into fire as Dozer was charged, his form lightly glowing and rippling shield that gave his forward momentum a slight, unstoppable feel. Vanguard was the odd one. He took any weapon that came within reach and turned them into half-eaten scraps, into deadly tools of war once more. Swords, axes, whips, table legs, anything that could be used was used, and Vanguard was a master at using them all. The broody gargoyle swung a sword, cleaving a glaring skull in two, while he splattered another foe with a club with the same momentum. Right, let's see. Doctor mused as he used a tiny set of stairs to get close to the cauldron. The slime slurped out of it, and the doctor pressed a tiny bundle of wrapped cloth into the body, where it fizzled powder, floated for a second, before the slime simply gargled and collapsed onto a puddle. "What is this thing?" Delta asked, focusing on the cauldron. The urge to switch between her monsters was strong, but she knew that if she could stop the cauldron, she could easily halve the number of slimes. Doctor ran his hands over several symbols, carved letters, and stains. Nothing good. I would say that this thing is the source of those monsters, but where it gathers resources from, and how it keeps itself alight and working, is a mystery. Doctor said, and stabbed another slime, pudding that tried to yank him into the cauldron. The fire. Maybe we can put it out, Delta said suddenly. Doctor let himself fall down the last of the stairs and dropped to his stomach in the dusty bowl that held the cauldron. Delta blinked and the embedded dark crystals. Those look familiar. Fire crystals. The angle and the distance to the ground means that I won't be able to swing a hammer to smash them. Of course, no fire to put out either. Doctor stood, and with some quick movements he used his claws to carefully balance on the lip of the cauldron. "Any ideas, my fair lady?" Doctor sounded rather calm, despite the sheer number of bubbling slimes that were rapidly forming at the bottom of the cauldron. Delta was sort of reminded of how cooking she was able to do. It had to be made monsters blobs at the bottom of the pot. Wait, that gave her an idea. Maybe we should throw stuff in and see if we can mess up the dish, she suggested. Doctor pulled out vials and more wrapped tiny powder and bags. "Allow me," he announced, and began to throw in his arsenal into the cauldron. Most of them just dissolved harmlessly and hissed out in a white smoke. The powder seemed to cling for longer, but the sheer volume of acidic green sludge simply washed it aside. "We need something more deadly than sin-quiet dust," Doctor responded in a same calm tone. Delta, however, could feel the agitation on his tools being outdone. Delta looked around, but the science scene in the hall was either being used as a weapons or the slimes all turned into dust long ago. She was beginning to panic when Jeb belly flopped and black slime went everywhere. At his side was a meat cleaver, a tenderizer, and a large jug corked with a simple brown lid. That cherry-red jug sloshed and something familiar. It was bad. But could it be that bad? "Jeb, give Doctor your troll soup," Delta yelled, and the troll didn't even look up, and he chucked the container across the room. Doctor leapt, and what was a jug, what for Jeb was a barrel for the doctor. He slid a few feet back, gasping, as he tried to slow down the projectile. He was now quite a bit away from the cauldron, and he began to stomp forward. Delta yelled a warning, as if sensing something was up. The puddings began to gather around the doctor, like a plague of locusts. They lashed out with their tentacles and knives, and the downside was that the Doctor couldn't progress and defend himself by turning to stone. Vanguard was like a vengeful angel. His weapons cleared a path forward, which Doctor took without slowing down. The panic in the slime seemed to rise, and a few began to blob together into some hybrid with a wave of trash and acid. Dragon responded by swooping down in a storm of fire. The light and the dark clashed, sending flaming bits of pudding everywhere, but the hole left behind was used by the Doctor to rush deeper. The cauldron was working overtime, shaking and hissing as it spat out puddings like no tomorrow. "You can do it!" Delta cheered, and the oncoming wave was torn apart, squishing and brown away by Nashley, Jeb, Dozer. Dozer was so near that he burst into a sprint. Delta felt Doctor's mind go crazy. He never felt more alive. The moment of victory was near, but the last moment, a pudding that had no items and no weapons rose out of the crack and tripped Doctor. He face-planted, almost breaking his beak mask right off. Delta cried as Jeb's brew bounced and rolled away. The slimes didn't touch it, but made a path to the jug in a nightmare of acid and bladed weapons. "Damn it all! I'll make them regret that," Doctor hissed, his foot crushing the slime that had tripped him, and the numbers flowing from the cauldron, and the side rooms were staggering. The air becoming fouler as the slimes gave off noxious fumes. Delta had little doubt that a normal person would have had their lungs scorched trying to breathe in here. The walls moved like water as the slimes ran out of room on the ground and began to claim the high ground. This was a nightmare. And what was worse, that they hadn't breached the inner sanctum of the lab yet. That cauldron kept spitting out more and more, and Delta had a horrible feeling that she had started it up like a long dormant auto factory. They would keep being produced, and Delta wasn't sure how they would begin to fix this. Inside, she began to feel the slime was crawling around her heart. It burned, and every second felt like a dark, morbid understanding that she might be over her head here. She opened her mouth to say something, to call her friends back, to yell in frustration and fear. She didn't know. Delta wouldn't be given a chance to find out as the jug rolled forward onto its side and the barrel out of a comedy movie. Jack the Kobold on top. "Move it or lose it, sisters. Remember me? I friggin' remember you. Today will be the day." He hollered and screamed as the barrel crashed the slimes. The burning muck hissed, and Jack's feet and the jug spun around and around. Nothing could stop him. Jack let the jug fly over the edge, himself still on it. "The day you almost caught Burning Jack Kobold and friends," he yelled in a mad glee, and the jug, the kobold, and several trapped slimes on the jug crashed into the cauldron, the cork and the jug flying off. The thick brown liquid seeped into it, and the cauldron began to give off a high, keening noise. The troll soup, Jack's mad laugh, and the jug itself sank into the cauldron and began to crack, dark light seeping out between the stone fissures. "She's gonna blow!" Delta screamed. Her monsters ran back as all the black puddings had gone stark still, shaking in time with the cauldron. Jeb and Nashley formed a trolley shield and round the gargoyles in the cauldron and gave one last shriek as the whole room shook. Delta felt a ripple through her body. The whole dungeon was shaking. Seth paused as the trees and rocks were fiercely for a moment. The queen and her subjects became a noise of furious buzzing. "Mother," Inchi whispered. Rennie took the bird and passed it to Seth. "Rennie, where are you going?" Seth called. The mime didn't answer, funnily enough. "He's going downstairs. Mama needs help," Inchi said quietly. Seth looked at the bird. "I could go," he offered. Inchi looked up, shaking his feathered head. He hopped onto Seth's shoulder. "We gotta have faith. Rennie is strong, and you gotta finish the tour. That's my job, to give you the tour," Angie said. The bird must have been worried because it didn't even pun once. Faith. Seth felt Trevor stop and honestly knew that he couldn't offer faith. The best he could do was trust. So he put on his best smile and let Inchi lead him onwards. His senses flickered, his mind being brushed gently by the stroke of magic. An assurance, a promise. A hot, smoky aftertaste told him that Kuss was already heading to check things out. The concern and softness of the embers of Kuss's magic would surprise most people, but Seth knew the man had the deepest warmth for those he cared about. Seth smiled, relaxing truly as he felt Quist move to follow Rennie. Between those two, perhaps he could have a little faith. End of chapter. That, my friends, concludes this episode. I hope that you enjoyed. If you wish to support the author of the story, there will be a link below. If you wish to support this channel, there are multiple ways to do so, which will all also be linked below. But the easiest way would be to subscribe and share my videos as much as possible. And until next time, I hope you all have a good one. And I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.